It seemed like my friends used to go camping with their families all the time, and I admit, it made me a little jealous of them. Since my parents split, I would only see my father once in a while, and mom was afraid of all things creepy crawly, so I'd only been camping one time ever, and that was a terrible experience. It was back when I was a Boy Scout. I got into a fight with another kid, and our parents had to come pick us up before the night was even over. That didn't really count as far as I was concerned. The way I looked at it, I had made it all the way to adulthood without ever truly enduring any nights out in the wild. In many cultures, that sort of thing is sacrilegious. Besides, my friends would never let me hear the end of it. They came up with a nickname for me that I won't share here, but the name was centered around me being too afraid to go out in the woods at night. I wanted to put an end to this foolishness at once. I called my cousin Julian one weekend asking if he wanted to join me up at the campgrounds. In return, he asked me how many beautiful women would be there. It took some serious persuasion on my part and a little bit of bribery, but I was eventually able to convince Julian to agree. He was game as long as I put in a good word for him with the new girl at my job. We made plans for the following weekend and then said our goodbyes. To my surprise, my cousin got to our camping area much earlier than expected, even beating me there. I still had about another 30 minutes of travel time, and Julian texted me that entire drive threatening to leave if I didn't arrive soon. When I pulled into the parking area, Julian was relaxing on the roof of his car. I grabbed the tent out from my trunk and we decided to set up while we still had a bit of natural light left. My cousin complained to me that I only had bought one shelter. He assumed he would be sleeping inside his own. I told him it wasn't a big deal and that it was only for one night. Julian declared he would be sleeping in his car. Whatever. He stayed on his phone most of the time while I started the fire. At least he didn't forget to bring our dinner. We used tongs to hold sausage links over the open flame. They weren't the elaborate campfire dinners I've seen in some online videos, but it was a start, and I was feeling a sense of accomplishment. By the time dark fully settled in, 2 additional parties had arrived and set up camp within eyeshot of us. One appeared to be a loving couple with their small child. I could faintly hear the baby talk and the cute kitty songs they would sing from time to time. The other party was a guy who looked around our age, and he seemed to be alone. Me and my cousin watched as the man parked his pickup truck and started removing his setup from his rear bed. I suggested to Julian that we walk over and introduce ourselves. He told me I was on my own. The guy's name was Brian. He had just had a bad argument with his girlfriend and was rambling on about some finding inner happiness stuff. I offered Brian some food. He in return offered us some beer. Our trip had just gotten way better. We chugged and chatted and shared old stories until after midnight. That's when Julian got a call from one of his VIPs. My cousin wanted privacy and was retiring to his car for the night. I didn't stay up much longer either. After a bit, I told Brian I was headed to bed myself and that we'd exchange contact info before leaving there in the morning. At least that's what I figured. I woke up around 7 a.m. to the sound of Julian singing along to his car stereo. I left my tent and walked over to my cousin's coupe. I noticed a young couple packing their camper back up. It looked like them and their toddler were about to head back on the road. I glanced over to Brian's station. His truck and canopy were still in the same places. I asked Julian if he'd see Brian yet that morning. He told me he hadn't. I suggested he and I drive down to a nearby diner to grab breakfast. But first I walked over to see if Brian wanted us to bring him anything back. His tent was empty, so was his truck. We figured he was the type to take early walks, and depending on how bad the argument with his girlfriend was, there was no telling how long he'd be gone. I broke my sleeping enclosure down and threw it back into my cargo area. Julian hopped in my SUV with me. We left his car behind, signaling to Brian that we'd return soon. About 40 minutes later, when we arrived back to the campsite, all of Brian's belongings were still in the same place, and he was still nowhere to be found. We waited around another 2 hours. Brian never showed back up. I wrote my info down on a slip of paper and slid it under his windshield. I noticed his cell phone lying on the driver's seat of his truck. For some reason, that stuck out his eye to me. Julian jumped in his car and was ready to leave. I told him to go ahead and that I would call him later. Something was telling me to walk around the area and make sure Brian wasn't lying out unconscious somewhere. I spent the next 30 minutes or so walking through the dense trees and calling out his name. All I found was a pair of old boots down by the creek, and I wasn't sure who they belonged to. Ultimately, I decided not to call the police. With my luck, I would have been a suspect in his disappearance. Besides, we had just met, and I convinced myself I didn't owe him anything more than what I did. So I climbed into my SUV and headed home. I was about 10 minutes into my drive when I received a text from Julian. It was a link to someone's social media page. I messaged my cousin back that I would check it out when I got home. When I did, my day became a lot weirder. Someone had recorded a video about 5 miles away from the campgrounds and uploaded it to their account. The recording was of a strange red rotating light pattern in the sky. The caption simply read, "View from my balcony." The post was from 2 in the morning, but the comments were still pouring in. As I read them, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. People were complaining of power and phone service outages. One lady was grumbling about her cats waking her up with their meowing and scurrying around her house. Yet others were saying they were woken up around that same time suffering from pounding headaches. I called Julian as I continued to scroll. He forwarded me posts of other users referencing the incident. One comment I read stuck out more than the rest. It was a woman who had typed her and her friends were out partying the night before. One of them went outside to their car to retrieve a sweater. That was the last time anyone saw her. I asked my cousin what he thought happened. Could this really be what it seemed like? In true Julian fashion, he said, "I hope so. I'm tired of paying taxes." It wasn't a big deal to him. And over time, the day-to-day responsibilities of life would push the memory of this event to the furthest regions of my mind. That wasn't until one day a few months ago. I was at a gas station fueling up my SUV. I glanced towards the street, and pulling into the parking lot was a pickup truck that I thought looked just like Brian's. The truck parked next to the convenience store. The driver got out and headed for the door. I got a good look at the guy's face. It was Brian. He walked inside the store. I finished gassing up, replaced the pump, and headed inside myself. As soon as I approached the door, Brian was walking out carrying a can of beer. I shot him a smile and said, "What's up?" He looked back and returned the gesture. He then turned back toward his truck and kept walking. "Brian," I said emphatically, not believing he didn't recognize me. He turned his head back and looked at me. "Me?" I reminded him of our interaction at the campgrounds almost a year before, but he shook his head and told me his name was Jack, and he said he hadn't been over to those campgrounds since he was a teenager. I watched Jack climb back in his truck and speed off. I spent the next few days trying to forget everything and convince myself that I had the wrong guy. But once Julian's version of the story spread among our friend circle, they came up with a new nickname for me. Nowadays, they call me AW, the Alien Whisperer. Still, through all this confusion, I think I learned one thing. Camping isn't for everyone.